The pre-Trump Republican Party is dead.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Josh Gilder. Josh Gilder is a former speechwriter for President Reagan. He's also an author and a commentator. We're going to be talking all about President Biden, Donald Trump's legacy, Ronald Reagan, and where the Republicans should go from here. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us.
Great to be here.
President Biden, America's new president, has had his inauguration a few days ago. He made this speech. It was all about unity and healing. Do you believe him?
Well, no. I mean, because in the same speech, he continued to disparage the 48 million people who had voted for Trump as racists, bigots, Nazis, white supremacists. So what he means is there's unity if you accept their woke agenda. Otherwise, you'll be censored, you'll be blacklisted, you may lose your job, and you'll suffer all sorts of bad consequences. And certainly you'll be disenfranchised, which is what we saw in this last election. So no, I don't believe it.
Many people praised the speech, as I mentioned earlier, for talking about these themes of unity and healing. And a lot of people were even saying this was one of Joe Biden's more charismatic speeches that he's made as a politician. Now, obviously, you wrote some of Ronald Reagan's famous speeches. You were a speechwriter for a while. What did you make of the speech?
Well, I thought it was flat and insincere, and everything with Biden has a certain surrealistic aspect to it. I mean, it was like in his campaign, where he was holed up in a basement the whole time, would come out, stumble through short prepared remarks, and then disappear back into the basement. And when he would have a rally, barely a handful of people would show up, and sometimes nobody would show up to his rally. I mean, it's a little bit odd to have a president who's so clearly cognitively impaired. And I don't really know what that means. I don't know that, Joe Biden always went with however the winds were blowing. He's not a principled politician, never has been. That isn't the issue, but I mean, who's really going to be calling the shots, how policies are going to be made? We can just expect an Obama, basically it's going to be Obama too, except really with all this sort of pent up anger and energy that the left has developed over the last 4 years. And they'll be pushing all of the, woke agenda. Clearly, I mean, we can see this in his executive orders that he issued yesterday, to basically undo everything he possibly can about with the Trump administration that the Trump administration has accomplished, and push basically an Obama agenda times 2. So that will be critical. Race theory, it will be all of these things.
How divided do you think America is? And do you think that both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, over the last 4 years have sort of been radicalized in a way?
Well, I think it's different on either side. I don't, I think that in terms of the Democratic Party, they've continued this sort of movement to the sort of progressive left, to the woke progressive left, environmentalist, whatever. I mean, and it's increasingly radical. I mean, you have seen in the last 4 years, you've seen that in the media as well, where they've dropped any pretense of actually reporting the news. And as much as said, I mean, I think they've, in many cases explicitly said their purpose is to advance their agenda, not to report the facts, and that's really what's going on. But so yeah, that is all, it has reached a stage that it's not before. I think on the Republican side, what you see is, Donald Trump was basically an insurgent candidate in the Republican Party. People said that of Reagan, and it was true, but not on the same level. And when he came in 2017, he really had no allies in the party, or almost none, maybe a handful. He had the Republicans in Congress as against him, probably as the Democrats were, or almost. So, because he was, what he demanded, and I think what he's accomplished, and I think it is one of his great accomplishments, is to have radically changed the party from more back to what it was under Reagan, less of what it had become in the intervening decades, which was irrelevant, largely irrelevant and ineffectual. And I think there are a lot of Republicans now in the Congress who are breathing a sigh of relief and thinking, oh, now we can get back to business as usual, being a permanent minority government, a permanent minority party, not really be challenged to take any kind of effective stand ever. They're dreaming. That's over. I don't know how this will all play out. I don't know what Donald Trump's plans are in the future, but the pre-Trump Republican Party is dead. It's like in those gangster movies where they say that guy's already dead. He just doesn't even know it yet. The Republican Party is like that. They're dead. It's a party of the past. They just don't. It's over for them. They just don't know it yet. Trump created a new constituency for the party. He demonstrated his effectiveness in delivering for them. You saw middle-class family wages had not risen in real wages, had not risen in decades. And they did under Trump for the first time because he pursued policies that all the establishment said were not possible and wouldn't work. And there was nothing to do. I mean, it wasn't just Barack Obama, it was the Republicans who were saying to all of these people who had been thrown out of work because we'd shipped their jobs overseas, mostly to China, had said, well, learn computer programming, that's the future. Trump said we can revitalize American industry and manufacturing, and he did it. And he said we can raise American wages again, and he did it. And he not only did it, he did it for the middle class. He achieved the lowest Black and Hispanic unemployment on record, which is why he significantly, really very significantly increased his vote among both Blacks and Hispanics in 2018. So Republicans who want to revert to the same sort of minority thinking, permanent minority thinking, I don't think they understand that these Trump voters now, it's not just that they had a leader who demonstrated that he heard them and understood them and wasn't going to just simply neglect, their needs or their, legitimate demands. I mean, he delivered for them. And it's going to be very hard to be the usual kind of ineffective Republican leader or ineffective Republican candidate after they've seen the example.
Do you think the Republican Party now is split? Now, I know you've said that the sort of more, let's call them the moderate establishment Republicans, perhaps Nikki Haley, Jeb Bush, that kind of person, you've said that their kind of party is dead. Yet at the same time, there are at least a group of Republican voters, they might be called the country club voters, who would probably maybe not like Trump so much. Maybe they didn't like his tweets. Maybe they didn't like his rhetoric sometimes. Do you think the Republican Party is split, or do you think it's going to go all the way down this kind of Trumpite, sort of, what do you call it, anti-establishment, insurgency party?
Yeah, well, I say it's dead, but that doesn't mean they're not going to hang around forever. I think they've got they've got no future. But they'll be around. There's an enormous amount of money there. There's a lot of interest in keeping them around. But I just don't. I think their electoral chances are very slim when they have, if they have, a good candidate opposing them. I don't. There's zero excitement there. They basically had no future even before this. And I also think that once somebody like Trump it's a little bit like Reagan, staked out what the possible, which everybody before said was impossible. Once he's demonstrated that is an opening for others to follow. Whether they will appear, whether it will be Trump himself, whether it will be, one of his children, whether it will be somebody else entirely that we don't know. I don't know, and it may not happen, but it's a more of a live possibility now than ever before.
And who would be your candidate for 2024 if you had to choose one?
I don't know. You sort of have to, the problem with presidential politics is there are a lot of people who look good on paper, and there are a lot of people who are good in fact at what they do. I mean, they might be governors, might be senators, congressmen, whatever. Presidential politics is just a very different game, and it demands a whole sort of complex of skills, and also just like people around you with experience and skills that that very few people have. It's and you can't really tell who's going to be good or not until you get in a campaign, largely. I mean, that's sort of what becomes evident in campaigns. So it's very hard to tell. I mean, but
do you think that Reagan and Donald Trump have some similarities? I mean, you've already mentioned, sort of implied that both of them were sort of, they're not the typical Republican presidents.
Right. Well, I think I think one of them was having a firm sense of what they were about and what they believed, and not caring too much what the establishment opinion was or what other people's opinions were, except for the American people, but they, whom they were always trying to communicate with and reach. But I think that, and as I said, I think it was an ability which apparently is very rare, is just to look at the facts as they are and see them for what they are, and be willing to say it, rather than engage in all sorts of intellectual obfuscations of, if like the Soviet Union is a competitor, or like China is a competitor, they're our enemy. It's not, and so being willing to really say it like it is like huge. I think really having a commitment to, they all ran to, I think I think their love for the country probably too. Now, I don't take this, obviously the Bushes loved America, were just as patriotic, but I think there's like a deep love and commitment and an understanding, probably deeper than others who have been in that position, of just how critical the United States is to freedom around the world. I mean, people, that's a platitude, and people will, in America it is, and everybody will say it, but I think they really got it. They really understood it, and they understood that America's Constitution, its laws, were all critical to keep, and its economy, and having a vibrant, innovative, expanding economy was critical to keeping that going. So American exceptionalism, essentially.
And do you think that politicians, we could talk about Joe Biden in this sense, have maybe forgotten these ideals of American exceptionalism? I think I saw recently people were comparing that phrase to even white supremacy, and these kind of identity politics. Woke people perhaps are not fans of America as a concept. They talk about this 1619 project, where America was founded, not in fact in 1776, but in 1619, when I think the first kind of slave trade began in that time. So do you think
slaves arrived?
First slaves arrived. Yeah. That's it. So has America lost its way in that sense?
Well, I don't think certainly half the country hasn't, but I think it's very clear that, you know, the Democratic Party and the media have all embraced the 1619 Project concept. I mean, what they explicitly say in the 1619 Project is what made American exceptional was that it was founded to on slavery. The revolution was to, this is just all completely ahistorical, but the American Revolution was in order to save slavery, right? And the institution of slavery is responsible for everything that we think makes it exceptional, including its, you know, its place in the world, its economic might, all of these things, which is nonsense. But anyway, so. But yeah, I mean, it's very clear that by the Biden administration completely embraces that. One of his first, you know, yesterday he issued something like 17 executive orders. So one of the first things he does, right, is to, I think within minutes of when he was inaugurated, President Trump's 1776 project, which is clearly an answer to the 1619 project, and it was about, you know, what is the American Constitution? What does it really mean? What is, you know, what was America really all about? Within minutes, that was taken down from the White House website. And yesterday, Biden, one of his executive orders was, I forget how it was phrased, but it was essentially to reinstitute these critical race theory, you know, cultural revolution style struggle sessions for federal government employees.
I'm keen to get your view actually on what Ronald Reagan would have made of Donald Trump if Mr. Reagan was still alive. What do you think he would have made of him?
Oh, well, you know, personally, they were very different. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I think, you know, some of the comparisons are really facile, though. I mean, sure, Ronald Reagan as president would never say anything mean about anybody. Ronald Reagan as governor had a sharper tongue, right? So he over time, he developed the presidential persona that we all have come to think of as Ronald Reagan. I think he was always a very nice guy, though. I also do not, you know, he didn't have, I mean, Donald, you know, he didn't have some of the sort of character issues that Donald Trump has, you know, the self-regard and the and that sort of thing. But so I don't, you know, that probably would have rubbed him the wrong way. But, you know, I also have to say is like, look, as I said, Ronald Reagan was one of the greatest men in history and certainly one of the great presidents, one of the greatest presidents. He accomplished more than I think anybody could have ever imagined could be in those 8 years. That said, many of the issues that we're dealing with now were things that were left unresolved during Reagan's time. For instance, you know, there's a lot of revisionism. I mean, if you look, you know, anytime you read about the 1980s now, first of all, everybody loved Ronald Reagan. They may not have agreed with him, but he was not true. He was reviled. He was called all the nasty things that Donald Trump has been called, and worse. Yeah, and you know, but the fact is part of like there was a decision, and you know, to basically, and this was an attempt to like move some of these programs through. There was huge pressure to moderate one's language and not like really tell it like it is, as I say. So just to give you an example, like a critical part of the Reagan agenda vis-a-vis the Soviet Union was dealing with the communists in Central America, including the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, right? And against them, there was, which would help, like with the U.S. helped stand them up, but they were also mostly Nicaraguans. You had the Contras, right? So every year there was funding. There was a battle in the Congress for funding the Contras, and it got harder and harder every year because, and you still see it today. You can't like watch a Netflix episode that has anything to do with anything, even tangentially involved in it, without somebody just basically slandering the Contras. They were all drug dealers or whatever. These were people, these were mostly peasants who were like fighting, the communist Sandinista government for freedom. So, but it got harder and harder every year, and it was like, you had actual conservative Democrats then who would vote for it, but more and more of these were being peeled off every time the vote came all up, and you had obviously all the weak-kneed Republicans as well. In this process, you actually had, Jim Wright, who was number 2 below Tip O'Neill, right, in the House, in the democratically controlled House. He brought the Sandinistas into his office to coach them on how to deal with, in terms of public relations, with the U.S. press in order to block passage of the Contra funding. That, and so, but we weren't really even allowed to talk about that. It would have been, and I remember I had a line in it, and it was really sort of an oblique reference to it, saying something to the effect of, if this goes down, if it doesn't pass, the American people will remember who lost Central America, which is like who lost East Europe. And that was that was verboten. You couldn't even say that. And you certainly couldn't call these people out for actually aiding and abetting, basically Soviet policy to destabilize Mexico and the United States, which is what that was all about. You couldn't say that. So the fact that we were so constrained in many ways about what we could say about the opposition, I think, every time you let somebody get away with that kind of thing, just like, you let them get away with it with Bork, the next time you have like Thomas, then you have Kavanaugh. It gets worse. They just escalate every single time because they're never really called on it. And I think that's a problem. And I think it was, I think that was one of the important pieces of work that we left undone.
Do you think Reagan missed the threat of China? Now, obviously, you mentioned China earlier in the interview. That's obviously, it's not quite the same as the USSR, but it's another communist superpower, almost a superpower. It seems more economically viable than the USSR. And to many, it's just as threatening to the United States, to the Western world. Obviously, President Reagan was around in the 80s. He could have perhaps done more to see the communist threat coming.
Well, China 40 years ago is not China today. So they weren't, that was picking up on Nixon's, opening to China, but that was all done to basically to undermine, counterbalance Soviet Union. That was the real threat at that time. A president it's not really fair to blame him for the failures of his successors, right? The China that developed afterwards, the response should have come from maybe George Bush Sr., but certainly George Bush Sr. I mean, and then W or Clinton and Obama. But that is where the failure was, and to a great extent with the Republican Party and a lot of conservatives who, and I have to say, for a long time there was a sense that China's everybody believed this. I believed it. I have to say, I bought into the idea, and it seemed reasonable that China's economic opening would create enormous pressure for democratization in China, right? They've been extraordinary in being able to reverse that process, to be able to keep, really a very vibrant, in many ways, very vibrant markets there under strict control, and prevent that from, and under Xi, I mean, he's just simply, and to be able to clamp down at the same time. But that process has only been possible because it's been enabled by the United States foremost and by Europe primarily. And if they had not been enabling it and effectively subsidizing it by allowing China to commit wholesale theft of our innovation, to basically with trade deals that gave China all of the advantage. We're basically subsidizing their authoritarian/totalitarian regime. So, I mean, but those are the I don't believe it's fair to blame Reagan for that. And you've got to understand, at that time, the number one issue was the Soviet Union, and everything else was important, but it's way down here. It had the Soviet Union is a real threat. Nuclear war is a real and terrible thing, potentially, and that has to be avoided. And the sort of mainstream idea was that you avoid nuclear confrontation by appeasement and by signatures on paper documents. And Reagan's idea was that you avoid it by confronting the issue square on and forcing reforms in the Soviet Union, which we did.
You worked for Ronald Reagan. Let's talk a bit about Ronald Reagan. Now, he was an absolutely fascinating man. He's got a big connection to the United Kingdom. Obviously, at the time when he was president, we had Margaret Thatcher as our prime minister. They were, they had this famous, very close relationship. What do you think made Ronald Reagan so special as someone who worked with him?
First of all, one of the things that enabled him and made him possible was Margaret Thatcher. And it's one of those sort of alternative history ideas, would a Reagan presidency have been possible or as successful without Thatcher? And I think the answer is no. I mean, we had three extraordinary leaders at that time: Thatcher, Reagan, and Pope John Paul II. And probably the whole, history would not have played out the way it did without all three of them. I believe so. What made Reagan special and one of the greatest presidents in American history is it wasn't his rhetoric. As much as I would like as a speechwriter to say, it was because he was a great communicator. It was, our rhetoric was good. Our speeches were good. They weren't that much, in a lot of ways, they weren't that much better than a lot of other speeches. You can always write a good speech. What was different was that his speeches, every one of his speeches was essentially an agenda. It was a promise. It said, I'm going to do this. And then he delivered. And that is in stark contrast to every other Republican president since then, because they might have very good speechwriters. I know some of them. They were very good, and they wrote really good speeches, but they didn't deliver, and often apparently didn't have any intention on delivering on what they were promising in their speeches. And I think that's why, that is why Reagan's popularity just grew throughout his 8 years in office, because people saw, and people respect that. They may not agree, but if they see that you're honest and you're committed and they understand why you're doing it, if you spell out for them what you're doing, and then you show that you're serious about it and you actually deliver the goods, that unfortunately, compared to most politicians, that sets you apart. And the thing about Reagan, I mean, it was in many ways it was analogous, because he was actually willing to look at the facts on the ground. At that point, the most important, the biggest one was the Soviet Union, right? And tell it like it is, that they were an expansionistic, totalitarian state intent on world domination. You were not allowed to say that then, and he did. and he was called a warmonger. He was called an idiot. He was like real vile. He was also called a racist. I mean, we were all called racists. If you're a Republican, you're a racist. And that started, 40 years ago. So, the entire foreign policy establishment said everything he proposes to do, this is going to increase tensions. It's going to probably precipitate World War III, and we're going to have nuclear winter, which turns out to be Soviet disinformation. And then we're going to, and we'll all be extinct because of Ronald Reagan, because of this cowboy who doesn't know what he's doing. And guess what? He turned out to be right. And brought down the Soviet Union without firing a shot, as Margaret Thatcher said.
How well did you know Reagan?
Well, I worked closely with him in the White House, but we didn't. I would not say that I knew him well. The funny thing about Reagan is, like, personally, he was a bit aloof. He was, so if you're too young, but if you saw him on TV at the time, or if you saw him in a public, situation, or if he was just walking by and he waved to you from the car, or like talked to you briefly as a member of the public, that was Reagan. That was the same Reagan that you got when you were in the Oval Office. He wasn't sort of one way in private and the other way with the public. It was exactly the same guy. But it wasn't like he wasn't. I worked with George Bush Sr. when he was vice president first. When I joined the White House staff, I first started as a speechwriter for the vice president. And George Bush was a really friendly guy, knew me well. Whenever he'd see me, he knew, and it's like really, really nice. I mean, also very thoroughly decent and honorable guy. Just great guy. You sort of felt that you knew him. I traveled with him all the time. And that was never true with Reagan. I don't think it was really true of anyone, apart from Nancy.
Do you think that, famously Bill Clinton was the president who welcomed China into the World Trade Organization? And as you mentioned there, both Bush Senior and Junior and Obama perhaps didn't do enough to confront the threat of China. Donald Trump, one of his probably most memorable acts as president in terms of foreign policy was just how much he was willing to confront China, whether it was with sanctions, or with using tariffs. And his rhetoric, at least, was very tough as well. Do you think President Biden, will revert back to the Clinton era policy, Bush era policy of trying to welcome China economically into the world stage and just hope that it becomes more democratic? Or do you think that Trump's, far more tough policy will have an impact on how Biden views and interacts with China?
No, I mean, I think it will basically be appeasement and an attempt to reverse the. I mean, I don't think on trade. I don't know that he'll allow whatever has been agreed and whatever happens really post-COVID, which is, it's all pretty unsettled now. But whatever was agreed with Trump, whether or not they actually tear that up, they'll just they'll look the other way as China continues to disregard whatever their commitments are, and continues to steal and continues to send spies into our universities and into our corporations. So no, I think it will be business as usual, or it will be Obama business as usual. Yeah.
Listen, I want to finish the interview by talking more about Reagan, because I think he's such a fascinating man and you've got this brilliant insight into him. One of the things that people find so great about Ronald Reagan was his sense of humor. And obviously, I know you've written some of his speeches. I wonder if you've written any of his jokes, but he made these fantastic sort of jokes about the Soviet Union. And he seemed very personable to many people. What do you make of the man in terms of his humor? Do you find him a funny man?
Well, I loved his jokes. And we recycled them shamelessly. So actually, most of the jokes that we used had come from him. from his old speeches, and where he got them, he would pick them up here or there. People would tell them to him. We mostly got them just from excavating old speeches. And I remember once he said, maybe we could use, in terms of the jokes, a little bit of fresh material. So he was like, but wonderful jokes. Those all came from him. I mean, he didn't make them up, but we weren't. We would invent some of the humor. I mean, I guess the most known thing I did was, I don't know, it was humorous, was the "Go ahead, make my day" line. That was, Democrats were proposing a tax increase in Congress, and Trump just was threatening to veto it, and he said, "Yeah, send it to me. I'll veto it. Use the dirty Harry line." So we would do things like that all the time, and we'd try, we'd do our best at humor, but we weren't as good as he was. No. But he could make anything. I mean, he could do any. The great thing about Ray, I've just got to say, as a speechwriter, you could give him anything and he would make it work. Once in a while, even the State Department would send over just some atrocious bureaucratic mumbo jumbo. And if it were about like sort of nuclear weapons negotiations or something like that, that was a case where the speechwriters really couldn't get their hands on it and edit it. So he had to deliver something like the State Department wrote, and it'd actually make it sound coherent and like even somewhat interesting. But if as a speechwriter, it wasn't like anybody was trying. In fact, the one actual rule I was told by the other speechwriters when I joined Reagan's staff, because I said, well, what should I read to make sure that I get Reagan's voice? And they said, no, whatever you do, don't try and write in his voice. Just write the best thing you can. He'll make it sound like him. And it's true. So none of us actually, if you read like our, the speechwriters who were there, like Tony Dolan, Dana Rohrabacher, Ben Elliott, Clark Judge, Peter Robinson, we all wrote very different. But when Reagan delivered it, it sounded like Reagan. And you could give him, like, the "Go ahead, make my day" line. No other politician that I've written for could have pulled that off the way he did. He did it perfectly. So he had he was good. He was just good. And it was a real pleasure as a speechwriter to write for him.
I suppose his acting skills must have helped him there.
Oh, they did. I mean, I remember he said, I forget who I think he said this to Tommy Smothers, but I maybe remember the Smothers brothers way before your time. They were a comedy act. But they came to visit him in the White House. And I think he said, I never could have done this president if I weren't, never could have done this job if I weren't an actor. So yeah, I mean, he employed a tremendous amount of artifice. It's funny, he employed the artifice to communicate what he authentically was and believed, but there was a tremendous amount of artifice, sure.
Absolutely. Listen, that's been an absolutely fascinating interview. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us.
Okay, my pleasure. Great to talk to you. Thanks.